Imagine like a single typo in a centralized computer database. Just, one transposed digit.
Right, just a tiny human error.
Exactly. And that one little mistake somehow cascades through the whole system and causes, I don't know, an entire continent's power grid to shut down in the dead of winter.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is.
Right.
And we look at a scenario like that and we immediately recognize that there is a catastrophic flaw in the engineering, right? Like a system that allows one localized error to trigger a massive fatal collapse. There's just a system built to fail.
Yeah, it's a mathematical guarantee of failure, really.
Right. I mean, we demand redundancy in our power grids. We demand it in airplane engines, our computer networks. We basically demand that a single point of failure cannot bring down the entire ship.
Well, we demand it in our technology, for sure. But we almost never apply that exact same rigorous engineering standard to the architecture of human society.
Oh, that is so true.
Yeah, I mean, when a society fails or when a nation slips into tyranny or a community just tears itself apart, we tend to analyze it like a soap opera.
A soap opera? What do you mean?
Like, we look at the personalities of the politicians, right? We look at historical grievances or, cultural shifts. We treat the whole thing as this grand drama.
Oh, I see. We argue endlessly about, who was driving the bus when it went off the cliff.
Exactly. But we almost never ask why the bus was designed with a steering wheel that could just detach in the first place.
Wow. Yeah. We totally ignore the physical design of the system itself.
We ignore the physics of it, yeah.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. I am incredibly glad you are joining us today because we are really throwing out the usual playbook.
We definitely are. This is going to be fun.
Usually, we take a stack of massive documents, entire books, research papers, and we synthesize the whole landscape for you to give you that shortcut to being really well informed.
But today, the mission is entirely different.
Completely different. Today, we are taking an absolute microscope to a single, hyper-dense, brilliantly constructed paragraph.
And honestly, it is one paragraph that functions quite literally as an architectural blueprint for human survival.
It's intense. So the source material we're looking at is a document called The Blueprint of a Peaceful World, version 1.0.
Which is, it's this public academic version.
Right. It's basically an academic framework attempting to define the operating system for a peaceful civilization. And within this massive manifesto, there is point 19.
Point 19, the Principle of Subsidiarity.
Or decentralization, yeah. I am going to read the core translation of this paragraph just to set the stage for you. Keep in mind, this is what we will be dissecting for the rest of our time together.
Every single word of it.
Okay, here we go. It reads, decisions must be made at the level where they are implemented. We oppose the excessive concentration of power, which makes mistakes fatal.
Such a powerful line.
Let me finish. We implement the principles of polycentric governance, Elinor Ostrom, and fractal governance. Strong communities and local self-government are the best safeguard against tyranny and the guarantor of sustainability, where the governance structure repeats the principles of self-organization at all levels.
I mean, it is just breathtakingly dense.
It really is. I had to read it like 4 times.
You could construct an entire university semester syllabus around unpacking just the economic and sociological implications hidden inside those 4 sentences.
Which is exactly why we are dedicating this entire deep dive just to the internal mechanics of point 19.
Right, we are not going to drift into the rest of the manifesto today.
Yeah, we're locking ourselves inside this specific framework because it fundamentally shifts the conversation from, who holds power to the actual structural geometry of the power itself.
Yeah, the geometry of power. I love that phrasing.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the very first sentence, which kind of serves as the anchor for the whole philosophy.
Yeah.
Decisions must be made at the level where they are implemented.
Right, and that right there is the formal definition of the principle of subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity. Okay, so to really grasp the mechanics of this, I was thinking about an analogy. Imagine a CEO of a massive global corporation.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
This CEO is sitting in some glass skyscraper in New York City, and they're trying to dictate the exact brand of coffee that a tiny branch office like 3,000 miles away in a different country should stock in their break room.
Oh, wow. That's micromanagement at its finest.
Right. Or, to make it even more granular, let's say the CEO is dictating exactly how the employees in that distant office should arrange their desks relative to the windows.
So the CEO has like a floor plan on their desk and a spreadsheet And probably some grand organizational theory about productivity.
Exactly. But the CEO has zero actual context. Like maybe the local office culture fundamentally revolves around tea, not coffee.
Right, they wouldn't know that.
Or maybe the afternoon sunlight hits that specific office building in a way that creates this unbearable glare if the desks are arranged according to the New York floor plan.
So they're just blinding their employees, basically.
Pretty much. The CEO is operating in a complete vacuum of tacit knowledge. You know, that kind of knowledge you only have if you physically sit in that room.
Yeah, the lived experience of the space.
So the decision is vastly inefficient, it generates immediate resentment from the staff, and it fails to solve the actual problem of creating a good workspace.
What's fascinating here is that the manifesto is taking this very practical concept from organizational management, this idea of subsidiarity, and it's elevating it to a fundamental mechanism for global peace.
Global peace from desk arrangements. It's quite a leap.
It is, but to understand why subsidiarity is framed as a peace-building tool, we have to really look at the psychological reality of information processing, because simply put, distance breeds abstraction.
Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that abstraction. Like, how does physical or hierarchical distance actually alter the way a human being processes a decision?
Well, think about when information moves up a hierarchy. So from the factory floor to the manager, then up to the regional director, the vice president, and finally to your CEO in New York.
Right, the chain of command.
Exactly. At every single step, that information must be compressed. You simply cannot pass along every human nuance, every interpersonal conflict, or every subtle environmental factor.
Because it would just be too much data.
Way too much. So the information gets stripped of its context just so it can fit onto a clean briefing document or a neat little spreadsheet.
Oh, I see.
By the time the data actually reaches the top, the living, breathing human beings with complex, localized needs, they've been completely transformed into data points. They just become statistics.
It's basically a lossy compression algorithm, right? Like with digital audio.
Yes.
You lose all the high-fidelity reality of the situation.
It is an entirely lossy process, yes. And here is the real danger of that. It is incredibly easy to make a cruel, damaging, or completely irrational decision when you are only interacting with an abstraction.
Because you don't see the real impact.
Right. When a decision maker is geographically or even just economically or socially isolated from the people their decisions affect, they do not feel the feedback loop of their actions.
They don't have to look anyone in the eye.
No, they don't.
And they don't have to live with the immediate fallout. I mean, going back to the analogy, if they mandate the wrong desks, they don't have to sit there squinting through the glare every afternoon.
Exactly. So what subsidiarity does is it forces that feedback loop to close. It demands that those who live with the consequences of a decision are the exact same people who are making the decision.
Which just makes so much sense when you say it out loud.
It really creates two non-negotiable elements for a stable society: immediate accountability and high-fidelity contextual awareness.
High-fidelity contextual awareness. I like that term.
Think about a local community deciding whether to route a new bypass road right through a local park.
Okay.
If the community makes that decision themselves, they are weighing the convenience of the faster road against the permanent, painful loss of their own green space. They actually feel the pain of the sacrifice.
Right, because their kids play in that park.
Exactly. But if a distant central transportation authority makes that exact same decision, they don't lose anything. To them, they are simply drawing a more efficient line connecting point A to point B on a topographical map.
Wow. Yeah, in systems theory, a system without a tight feedback loop simply cannot self-correct. It just spirals.
Exactly.
So subsidiarity is essentially a mandate for the tightest possible feedback loop. It's like an antidote to the inherent blindness of the top-down perspective.
That's a great way to put it. You don't try to buy better glasses for the person at the top of the pyramid.
Right. You just move the decision-making power down to the base where the vision is naturally 20/20.
Yes. The manifesto is essentially arguing that the further away you move the decision from the implementation, the more inherently unethical the decision becomes.
Yeah.
Simply because of that structural blindness.
Unethical. That's a strong word, but I get it.
It is strong, but think about it. A blanket policy handed down from 1,000 miles away will almost always act as a form of structural violence against the local reality.
Because a uniform policy just can't account for infinite local variables.
Precisely. It forces a square peg into a round hole, and the local people are the ones who get crushed in the process.
Okay, well, that sets up the stakes perfectly for the very next line in point 19. Because if subsidiarity is the ideal mechanism, the manifesto immediately identifies an existential threat to that mechanism.
The concentration of power.
Right. The text states, "We oppose the excessive concentration of power, which makes mistakes fatal."
Which makes mistakes fatal.
Now, I have to pause here and throw a bit of a wrench into this, because I understand the danger of the CEO making bad desk arrangements. But let's escalate the scenario a bit.
Okay, let's hear it.
What if we are facing a sudden massive crisis? Like a natural disaster rips through a region, or a global pandemic breaks out, or the economic market suddenly crashes overnight.
The classic emergencies.
Right. And the historical consensus has generally been that centralized power is the only mechanism fast enough to handle true emergencies. I mean, I don't want 1,000 local town councils debating emergency response protocols while the floodwaters are literally rising.
No, you want someone taking charge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I want a central authority, one single steering wheel to mobilize resources instantly. The argument for centralization is basically always rooted in that emergency efficiency.
And you are not wrong to bring that up. The efficiency in a crisis argument is probably the most powerful justification for authoritarianism in human history.
Because it works, or because we're scared.
Because we're scared. It's a compelling argument because it relies on our deeply ingrained biological panic response. When we are threatened, we look for a strong leader to save us.
Right, it's human nature.
But the manifesto requires us to look way beyond that immediate mobilization speed. We have to focus intensely on that one word, fatal. The authors of this blueprint are working from a baseline assumption that human error is inevitable. Leaders will miscalculate, data is going to be misinterpreted, biases will absolutely blind decision makers.
So mistakes are a guarantee.
100% guaranteed. So the architectural question is not how to prevent mistakes, because biologically, that's impossible.
Right.
The question is how to survive them.
Oh, I see. It's the concept of managing the blast radius.
Exactly. Let's apply that engineering concept of the single point of failure we discussed at the very beginning. Remember the bridge?
Yeah, the suspension bridge.
Right. If you design a bridge where the structural integrity relies entirely on one massive central pylon, and that pylon develops even a microscopic stress fracture.
The entire bridge collapses into the river. Total disaster.
Right. The mistake in material science becomes entirely fatal to the whole system.
But if you design it differently?
Exactly. If you design a suspension bridge with a distributed network of thousands of smaller cables, and let's say 5 of those cables suddenly snap.
The bridge might sag a bit. It definitely requires maintenance, but the structure itself holds.
The structure holds. Now let's map that directly onto political and social structures.
Okay, let's do it.
If a centralized, absolute national authority makes a terrible policy decision regarding, say, agricultural supply chains.
Like farming quotas or something.
Yeah, perhaps they mandate that all farmers must grow a specific type of crop.
Yeah.
And that crop fails catastrophically due to some local blight that the central planners didn't anticipate.
Because they're in a skyscraper and not looking at the soil.
Right. What is the result?
Yeah.
The result is widespread national famine. That single point of failure triggers a massive systemic collapse. Millions starve.
Wow. Yeah, that's a massive blast radius.
Now imagine a deeply decentralized system instead, where the 1,000 local municipalities manage their own agricultural reserves based on their own highly local climate and soil conditions.
Okay, so 1,000 different approaches.
Right. If one of those town councils completely mismanages their reserves, it is a localized tragedy. That specific town suffers deeply.
That's terrible for that town, obviously. But the neighboring towns survive.
Exactly.
And more importantly, I'd imagine the neighboring towns observe the failure of that specific policy and adapt their own behaviors. They learn from it.
Exactly. The failure is isolated. It doesn't drag the whole nation down. And it serves as crucial evolutionary data for the rest of the network. Centralization takes the inevitable mistakes of human leadership, and it amplifies them to an apocalyptic scale.
It maximizes the blast radius. It makes the mistake fatal for everyone.
Precisely.
You know, I look at modern technology and I see this massive temptation constantly pushing us toward that exact kind of centralization.
Oh, absolutely. Technology is a huge accelerant for this.
Right, because the argument used to be that the central government didn't have enough information to make good local decisions, so they couldn't centrally plan everything even if they wanted to.
The calculation problem, yeah.
Yeah. But today, a centralized authority can collect just unimaginable amounts of data. I mean, they have the logistics tracking, real-time population monitor on our phones, algorithmic predictive models.
All of it.
So the illusion is that technology has basically cured that top-down blindness. And therefore, we should centralize decision-making because, the AI at the top knows best.
That is a very dangerous illusion. The Manifesto is issuing a severe warning against that specific kind of technological hubris.
How so? Isn't data a good thing?
Data collection is not the same thing as contextual understanding. A complex algorithmic model processing millions of inputs actually increases the abstraction we were just talking about.
Oh, I hadn't thought of it like that.
Yeah, an AI making resource allocation decisions for 50 million people is the ultimate form of distance. It cannot feel the consequences of a bad calculation. It doesn't grieve when a town starves.
Wow. So it's the ultimate single point of failure, just dressed up in better code.
Exactly. It's a shiny new pylon, but it's still just one pylon holding up the bridge. The system Point 19 advocates for is fundamentally anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile, meaning it gets stronger from shocks.
For at least it assumes the world is too complex, the variables are too numerous, and the future is too unpredictable for any single center of power, human or artificial, to manage it perfectly.
Right.
Therefore, the only logical, survival-oriented architecture is one that assumes failure will happen. And it designs bulkheads to contain the water when the hull inevitably breaches.
Which just begs the immediate question, what exactly does that architecture look like?
It's the million-dollar question.
Because if a single pyramid of power is a mathematical liability because of the massive blast radius, what do we replace it with? I mean, we can't just fracture society into a million disconnected, isolated little villages that never talk to each other.
No, of course not.
Because that isn't a blueprint for a peaceful world. That's just a recipe for constant tribal warfare and absolute zero large-scale cooperation. We'd never build hospitals or space programs.
And that false dichotomy, this idea that it's either absolute centralized control or chaotic tribal isolation, that is exactly what the text breaks apart in the very next clause.
Oh, right. Because the Manifesto doesn't actually leave us guessing here. It explicitly name-drops a specific solution and an economist.
Which is very rare for a document like this.
Yeah. The text says, we implement the principles of polycentric governance, Elinor Ostrom. And I have to tell you, I had to dive deep into this because Ostrom is not exactly a household name for most people.
She really should be, though.
She really should. Because her work is completely paradigm-shifting. She was actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics.
In 2009, I believe.
Right. And she won it by essentially taking a massive sledgehammer to one of the most deeply held cynical beliefs about human nature, the tragedy of the commons.
Garrett Hardin's famous theory.
Yes, Garrett Hardin. Which is basically this idea that if a group of people share a resource like a pasture for grazing, or a forest, or a water source, their own individual selfishness will inevitably drive them to overconsume and destroy the resource, unless a coercive external force stops them.
Right. Hardin essentially argued that humans are completely incapable of sharing without a boss.
Right. You either need a massive centralized state government to regulate the pasture with an iron fist, or you need to completely privatize it and hand it over to a single owner who will fiercely protect their investment.
There was supposedly no third option. It was a very bleak view of humanity.
But Ostrom proved the third option existed. And she didn't just theorize it. She left the university chalkboard and actually looked at the real world.
She did incredible fieldwork. She studied complex, shared resources all around the globe.
Like the lobster gangs of Maine. I was reading about that.
Wait, you read about the lobster gangs?
Yeah. These local fishers who manage incredibly lucrative fishing waters all by themselves, just through social agreements and local enforcement. No government oversight telling them what to do.
Yes. She looked at them. She looked at ancient irrigation systems in Nepal, communal forests in Japan, the Spanish huertas.
And what she found just completely defied the central planning models.
Completely. These communities had been managing these shared resources sustainably, sometimes for literally centuries, without a skyscraper CEO and without a dictator.
It's amazing.
They developed incredibly complex, localized rules. They mapped out their own boundaries. They created graduated sanctions for rule breakers. And most importantly, they developed their own fast, low-cost conflict resolution mechanisms.
So they designed highly functional governance systems entirely from the bottom up.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's define the actual term the Manifesto uses based on her work.
Yeah.
Polycentric governance. Polycentric simply translates to many centers. So, if a monocentric system is the pyramid-like one supreme peak, one final boss, What does a polycentric system actually look like in practice?
It looks like a complex, overlapping web. I'd say the field of it less like a rigid organizational chart and much more like a neural network or a thriving biological ecosystem.
Okay, a web.
In a polycentric society, there's no single supreme authority dictating all aspects of life. Instead, you have multiple overlapping centers of decision-making, and they all operate at different scales.
Okay, let's try to visualize this. Let's say I live in a town.
Right.
I might be governed by a local neighborhood water board that specifically manages our drinking reservoir. But simultaneously, I'm also part of a regional transportation council that handles the trains for the whole county.
Yes.
And maybe I'm also part of a local dispute resolution center for civil issues. And my community as a whole is tied into some global environmental monitoring network.
Perfect example. Now, notice how those centers don't neatly stack on top of each other. It's not like middle management reporting to a regional boss.
Right. The Regional Transportation Council cannot dictate what the local water board does.
Exactly. They have completely different jurisdictions, different scopes, and often entirely different methods of operating. They overlap, they interact, they frequently negotiate.
Sometimes they probably even compete for resources, right?
Yes, they do, but very often they cooperate to solve problems that cross their boundaries.
It really sounds like an orchestra without a conductor.
I love that analogy.
Like the string section, the brass, the percussion, they're all operating with their own sheet music.
Yeah.
But they're constantly listening to each other, taking subtle cues,
Yeah.
adjusting their tempo to remain in harmony.
Without one person standing on a podium, waving a baton, dictating every single quarter note to every single musician. The critical mechanism here is that these multiple centers constantly check and balance each other. So if we connect this back to the blast radius problem, the danger of fatal mistakes we were talking about,
Yeah.
polycentric governance is basically the architectural realization of the submarine with bulkheads.
How so? Walk through the failure mechanism in a polycentric web.
Okay, imagine one node in this massive web, let's say a regional energy council, becomes corrupt. Or maybe it gets taken over by a bad actor, or it simply makes a catastrophic miscalculation.
Okay.
In a centralized system, that corruption pumps directly into the heart of the nation. It infects everything. But in a polycentric web, the failure is isolated.
Oh, because the other nodes are independent.
Exactly. The other overlapping nodes, the local municipal energy co-ops, the environmental monitoring boards, the neighboring regional councils, they immediately sense that failure.
And they react.
They push back. They route resources around the failing node. They isolate the damage.
So the web flexes. It might lose a thread, sure, but the structural integrity of the whole thing remains totally intact. The system actually compensates for the failure.
This is a profound conceptual shift for how we imagine world peace. The Manifesto is implicitly arguing that a single, unified world government, even one built with the best of intentions and the absolute finest democratic ideals, is a monocentric pyramid.
And therefore an apocalyptic danger.
Exactly. It is the ultimate single point of failure. True peace is not achieved by building a bigger pyramid. It is achieved by weaving a web so dense, so redundant, and so highly interconnected that no single shock and no single tyrant could ever unravel it.
It's basically an ecological approach to governance. Like, you don't manage a forest by appointing a CEO tree.
A CEO tree. That's brilliant.
The forest just sustains itself through thousands of overlapping, competing, and cooperating biological systems.
Right.
But let's ground this in reality for a second, because a web of overlapping authorities, it really sounds incredibly messy. I mean, how do you scale an orchestra without a conductor?
It is the biggest challenge of the model.
How do you ensure that these thousands of different nodes don't just devolve into a chaotic mess of contradictory laws, like where you can't even figure out what the rules are from one town to the next?
Right, jurisdictional nightmare.
There has to be some kind of organizing logic, right?
Or
The web just tangles itself into a knot.
that is the exact vulnerability of polycentricity. And it is exactly why point 19 does not stop with Elinor Ostrom. It immediately pairs her work with the organizing logic required to make the whole thing scale.
Oh, right. The text says, we implement the principles of polycentric governance and fractal governance, where the governance structure repeats the principles of self-organization at all levels.
Fractal governance.
This is where the theory gets incredibly beautiful from a design perspective, I think. Because when I hear the word fractal, my mind goes straight to nature or mathematics.
Yeah, visual patterns.
Think of a fern leaf in the woods or a Romanesco broccoli. If you look closely at one of those.
They're really spiky green ones. Yeah, they're mesmerizing.
They are. It's the geometry of self-similarity. If you look at the whole fern leaf, you see a specific triangular shape with little branches coming off it.
Right.
But if you zoom in on just one of those tiny branches, it isn't just a random flat leaf. It is an exact microscopic replica of the whole entire fern.
The geometry repeats perfectly at every single scale, from
Yeah.
the microscopic cell cluster all the way up to the macroscopic plant.
Exactly. But how does a biological shape or a mathematical concept apply to how human beings pass laws or resolve disputes?
Well, the Manifesto is essentially applying the concept of structural DNA to human organization. Fractal governance means that the fundamental protocol of how we interact with each other must be identical at every single level of society.
Okay, break that down for me. What kind of protocols?
The ethics of respect, the specific mechanisms for reaching consensus, the processes for conflict resolution. The rules of the game do not change just because the stakes get higher.
So the structural DNA remains the same whether you zoom in or zoom out. That's fascinating.
Let's actually look at the negative space to really understand this. What does a non-fractal society look like? Because we live in non-fractal societies right now.
We do. Okay, give me an example.
Think about a modern Western nation. At the macro level, it waves the flag of democracy, right? It holds national elections, it champions free speech, it has a constitution protecting human rights, it operates on a stated protocol of distributed power.
Right, that's the big picture, the whole fern.
But if you zoom in,
Oh, I see where you're going.
if you zoom into the micro level, the actual places where citizens spend the vast majority of their waking lives, the protocol is completely different. Look at the typical corporate workplace.
It is an absolute top-down autocracy.
Completely. The boss dictates the rules, the employee obeys or is terminated. There is absolutely no voting on the company direction for the average worker.
Wow, yeah. Or look at the traditional classroom, which is rigidly authoritarian. The teacher speaks, the students listen.
Exactly. Look at how many family dynamics still operate on sheer dominance.
So the macro claims to be democratic and cooperative, but the micro is actually a dictatorship. The fractal is broken.
The fractal is totally broken. The freen leaf is a triangle at the top, but the branches are just chaotic authoritarian squiggles.
And from an architectural standpoint, a broken fractal has to be inherently unstable.
Highly unstable. If the daily lived experience of the population is submission to authority, if they spend 8 hours a day in an autocratic office environment, then national democracy is nothing but a fragile veneer.
Because they aren't actually practicing democracy.
Right. You cannot build a resilient culture of self-governance at the top if you are actively training people to be subservient at the bottom. The system will eventually collapse under the weight of its own structural hypocrisy.
That is profound. And the Manifesto directly counters this by demanding that the governance structure repeats the principles of self-organization at all levels.
Yes. It solves the chaos problem of the polycentric web. You have thousands of different overlapping nodes, yes. But because the system is fractal, every single node operates on the exact same core principles of self-organization.
Let me make sure I am grasping the practical application here. If my local neighborhood block association uses a specific method of, say, deep listening and consensus building to resolve a dispute over a property line.
Yes.
That exact same structural process, that exact same ethical protocol is what a continental coalition uses to resolve a dispute over a shared river system.
Precisely. The scale of the problem changes. Sure, the resources involved change. But the fundamental geometry of the human interaction remains identical.
You don't switch from a friendly consensus model at the local level to a coercive military model at the global level.
Exactly. This creates massive coherence across the entire web. You don't need everyone to agree on the specific policies, but you ensure everyone is using the exact same language of conflict resolution.
Think of it like building with Lego bricks.
Lego bricks.
Yeah. Every individual Lego piece in the bin can be a different color, a different shape, a different size.
Right.
You can use them to build an infinitely complex polycentric web. A spaceship, a castle, a cityscape.
Okay, I follow.
But the tiny interlocking bumps on the top and the little tubes on the bottom, the actual connection mechanism, are perfectly identical on every single piece. From the tiniest one-dot piece to the massive base plates. That connection protocol is the fractal element. It allows infinite diversity without losing structural integrity.
That is a perfect analogy. It is a brilliant design requirement. And the manifesto makes it super clear that this beautiful interlocking fractal structure isn't just an aesthetic ideal for philosophers to debate over tea.
No, it has a purpose.
It serves a very specific hardened security function,
Yeah.
which leads us directly to the final and frankly the most audacious claim in point 19.
The text concludes by stating strong communities and local self-government are the best safeguard against tyranny and the guarantor of sustainability.
The best safeguard against tyranny.
Now, I have to challenge the mechanics of this a bit, because it sounds inspiring, really does. But history is a remarkably violent and unforgiving place.
It is.
Can a network of local communities really stop tyranny? We have centuries of historical data showing us that tyrants with standing armies, secret police, and total control of the media can roll right over small communities with terrifying ease.
They do it all the time.
So how does a self-governing local council, armed with nothing but a fractal consensus model, actually serve as a physical shield against a centralized, violent, authoritarian regime?
It's the ultimate test of the theory. To understand how a community actually acts as a shield, we have to look really closely at the original Russian phrasing used for the word safeguard in this academic text.
Okay, what's the word?
The word used is предохранитель. And if you consult a Russian engineering manual, that word translates directly to a fuse.
A fuse, like in an electrical circuit box.
Exactly like that.
Okay, so what is the mechanical function of a fuse?
Well, when a massive, dangerous surge of centralized power hits an electrical system, say a lightning strike or huge grid malfunction, that surge threatens to burn down the entire house.
Right, it'll fry everything plugged into the wall.
So the fuse is specifically designed to break the circuit. It intentionally severs the connection to isolate the surge. It sacrifices a small, localized bridge to protect the integrity of the wider network.
Oh, wow. That totally reframes the entire concept of resistance.
Yeah.
Let's look at the anatomy of a coup d'etat then. How does a tyrant actually take power?
A dictator is entirely reliant on the pre-existing efficiency of a centralized state. They rely on pulling levers.
Levers that are already installed.
Exactly. If a society is highly centralized, capturing the nation requires only a few very precise logistical strikes. You capture the central bank, you capture the national broadcasting headquarters, you capture the parliament building, and you secure the loyalty of the central military command.
Because all the power flows through those few bottlenecks.
Right. The machinery of control, the mass surveillance, the taxation systems, the unified police force. It is already built, and it is already facing downward. The tyrant simply executes the former CEO, sits in their chair, and begins pulling the exact same levers.
And it works because the entire population has already been conditioned to look to the top of the pyramid for their instructions. They're used to obeying the center.
Exactly. The circuit is fully connected from top to bottom, so the surge of authoritarian power flows instantly from the capital city into every single home.
But what happens if the tyrant attempts to execute a coup in a society that is fundamentally built on point 19?
Think about it. The society is deeply polycentric. It is highly decentralized. The structural DNA is fractal.
There are no central levers to pull.
There is no central lever. If the tyrant storms the capital city and captures the central administrative buildings, they have literally only captured a few buildings.
Because the local towns don't rely on those buildings to function.
Exactly. The surge hits, but the thousands of polycentric nodes simply act as fuses. They recognize the authoritarian surge, and they just break the circuit. They disconnect from the center.
So they just stop listening. They ignore the capital.
Yes. The logistics of conquering a true polycentric network are an absolute nightmare for an authoritarian military force. You cannot just take the capital and call it a day. You have to individually conquer, pacify, occupy, and permanently suppress tens of thousands of highly organized, self-sufficient micro-communities.
Because each one is its own center of gravity.
Right. These are communities that do not rely on a central supply chain for their water, their food, or their conflict resolution. It becomes mathematically and economically impossible to sustain an occupation over a population that is not structurally dependent on you.
The tyrant basically dies of logistical exhaustion.
Precisely. They run out of energy trying to micromanage a million independent nodes.
This ties so perfectly into the manifesto's specific use of the word sustainability. The text says it's the guarantor of sustainability. And, in modern dialogue, we immediately map that word to environmentalism, like carbon footprints, recycling, solar panels.
Right, going green.
But the manifesto, while it certainly encompasses ecological sustainability in this specific context, it really means the sustainability of the social fabric itself.
Yes, it means resilience. When a massive crisis hits, An economic depression, a severe pandemic, a severed global supply chain. A highly centralized society is incredibly brittle.
Because they're waiting for orders.
Exactly. The people wait for instructions from the top. And if the top is paralyzed or corrupted or simply overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of the disaster, the people just freeze. Panic sets in because the single point of failure has failed.
But in a society with strong local bonds, a society that is actively practiced in the daily art of local self-government.
They do not wait for the skyscraper CEO to tell them what to do. They already know how to organize. They already know their neighbors' skills. They already have overlapping polycentric networks to manage their local agriculture and water supplies.
And they just absorb the shock. They adapt at the local level, and they keep functioning.
Yes. Tyranny and societal collapse both require a population that is isolated, dependent, and completely atomized. Point 19 recognizes that a strong, interconnected community is the exact opposite of that vulnerability.
This entire deep dive, it really requires us to undergo a massive paradigm shift regarding how we define safety. Because we are deeply conditioned through centuries of narrative and history and movies to believe that safety comes from a strong, centralized protector who guards the weak, disorganized masses.
We are always looking for the hero on the white horse. In times of trouble, we basically beg for the strongman to centralize power and make the chaos go away.
But the blueprint of a peaceful world completely inverts that paradigm.
It does. It argues structurally that safety never flows from the top down. Safety is generated when the masses are so structurally sound, so densely interconnected, and so fluent in the mechanics of self-organization that a centralized authoritarian leader becomes completely obsolete.
Obsolete. The dictator just becomes a redundant feature that the polycentric web simply routes data around, like an error in the code.
Exactly. Think of a healthy biological body. It does not have a dictator cell commanding the trillions of other cells.
No, it doesn't.
The cells operate polycentrically, they communicate locally, guided by a shared fractal DNA, and that localized interaction is what actually generates the immune system. Point 19 is not describing a political party, it is describing the literal immune system of a peaceful civilization.
Wow. We've covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today, and it was entirely contained within 4 sentences. Let's just retrace the architecture we mapped out.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
It is. We began with subsidiarity, the absolute necessity of keeping decisions close to the ground, close to the people who bear the actual consequences, to cure the structural blindness and cruelty of abstraction. We recognize that moving decisions up a hierarchy strips humans of their context and just turns them into data points.
And then we explored the fatal mathematics of concentrated power. We saw that centralization does not prevent errors. It simply maximizes the blast radius of inevitable human mistakes, creating a fragile system where one fractured pylon brings down the entire bridge.
Which pushed us to find an alternative to that dangerous pyramid, leading us straight to Elinor Ostrom's polycentric governance.
The orchestra without a single conductor.
Yes. A resilient, overlapping web of decision-making centers that constantly check, balance, and compensate for each other, proving that humanity actually can manage its shared resources without surrendering to a dictator.
And we discovered how to actually scale that massive web without descending into chaos through fractal governance. We saw that the ethical protocol, the DNA of self-organization and consensus, must be identical whether you're resolving a dispute in a local neighborhood or negotiating a global treaty.
Because a society simply cannot be democratic at the top and authoritarian in the workplace. The fractal breaks.
Exactly. And finally, we realized that building these localized, self-governing communities is not just some romantic utopian hobby.
No, it's a hardened logistical defense strategy. It creates a society built of thousands of fuses, rendering the entire network completely immune to the top-down surges of tyranny.
It is a profound, demanding vision, and it places the responsibility for peace squarely on our own daily interactions.
Which brings me to the final thought I want you, the listener, to carry with you today. We spent an hour analyzing the macro architecture of a peaceful world. But the defining feature of a fractal is that the macro is entirely dependent on the micro.
The tiny branches of the fern.
Right. So I want you to look closely at your own immediate reality. Look at the dynamics in your family, your workplace, the boards you sit on, or the community groups you belong to.
Where is power dangerously concentrated in your own spheres? Where are decisions being made far away from the people who actually have to implement them?
Are you living in a broken fractal? And most importantly, what is one specific, mechanical way you can start building a true fractal of self-organization right where you are? How can you push for a tighter feedback loop in your office? How can you foster polycentric cooperation in your own neighborhood instead of just waiting for the city council to fix a problem?
Because if the logic of this manifesto holds true, world peace does not originate in a glamorous, centralized global headquarters somewhere.
It doesn't begin with a charismatic leader signing a treaty on a mahogany table.
Peace begins with the structural DNA of how you and your neighbors make a simple decision.
We started this deep dive talking about the comfort of an X-ray. The desire for a clean, visible break we can point to when things go wrong in society. Point 19 doesn't offer a clean, binary slogan to chant. It offers an engineering schematic.
A literal blueprint.
It shows us that peace is not an emotion. Peace is an architecture, and the bedrock of that architecture is decentralization.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly focused, deep exploration today. It takes genuine intellectual stamina to take one single paragraph, put it under a microscope, and unpack its mechanics until the wider implications become clear. But that is where true understanding lives, not in the skimming, but in the depths. We will be back next time to pull apart another complex topic, but until then, keep examining the architecture around you. Keep asking where the decisions are being made. Have a great day.